"You're too heavy." He sneered, his cruel laughter echoing across the crowded ballroom as Clara hit the marble floor. He thought she was just a helpless punchline. He didn't know the most feared man in Chicago was watching from the shadows, and that one insult had just signed his death warrant. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria in downtown Chicago hummed with the quiet, expensive murmur of the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over women in couture gowns and men in bespoke tuxedos. It was the annual O'Connor Foundation Gala, a gathering of old-money corporate sharks and political heavyweights. Standing near the perimeter of the room, clutching a crystal flute of sparkling water, was Clara Higgins. Clara did not belong here, and the room was making sure she knew it. As a senior forensic accountant for Deloitte, she had been strong-armed into attending by her firm's partners to represent their auditing division. She was brilliant, holding 2 master's degrees, and possessing a mind that could untangle the most complex webs of financial deceit. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, all anyone saw was her size. Clara was fat. She carried her weight with a quiet dignity, but in a room filled with size 0 socialites and men who viewed women as mere accessories, she felt the sharp, judging stares peeling away her confidence. She had spent a month's salary on a custom emerald green wrap dress, hoping the luxurious silk would offer her some armor. Instead, she felt like an intruder occupying too much space. Look at her. Did she eat the catering staff before she got here? The voice was loud intentionally, so carrying over the soft jazz playing in the background. Clara stiffened her knuckles, turning white around her glass. A few feet away stood Braden Hayes, the golden boy of the Hayes real estate empire. Braden was a trust fund aristocrat who had never worked a day in his 26 years of life. With perfect blonde hair, a superficial charm, and a cruel streak a mile wide, he was holding court with a group of sycophants who eagerly laughed at his every word. Clara took a deep breath, fixing her eyes on the exit doors. "Just walk away," she told herself. "Don't give them the satisfaction." She began to navigate her way through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was almost to the grand foyer when Braden deliberately stepped into her path. "Whoa, watch out," Braden mocked, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "Oversized load coming through." Clara kept her gaze down, trying to sidestep him. "Excuse me, Mr. Hayes." But Braden wasn't finished. As she moved to pass, he casually shifted his weight, sticking his polished Oxford shoe directly over the hem of her trailing emerald silk gown. At the same time, he rammed his shoulder hard into hers. The physics of the moment were entirely out of Clara's control. Her forward momentum, combined with her trapped dress, and the violent shove sent her plummeting forward. She hit the unforgiving marble floor with a sickening thud. The wind was instantly knocked out of her lungs. Her knees absorbed the brunt of the impact, sending sharp spikes of pain shooting up her legs, while her palms scraped painfully against the polished stone as she tried to catch herself. The crystal flute shattered, sending shards of glass and cold water across her legs. The jazz music seemed to fade into the background. The low hum of conversation stopped. A suffocating silence blanketed the immediate area, followed instantly by a chorus of gasps, and then the laughter. Braden looked down at her, his lips curled into a vicious, triumphant smirk. He didn't offer a hand, he didn't apologize. Instead, he delivered the punchline to his sycophantic audience. "I'd help you up." Braden laughed, his voice ringing out clearly in the sudden quiet. "But honestly, you're too heavy. I'd throw my back out." The circle of onlookers erupted into cruel chuckles. Clara lay there for a second, her vision blurring with hot, humiliated tears. The physical pain in her scraped hands and bruised knees was nothing compared to the crushing, suffocating weight of the public degradation. She felt utterly exposed, a massive, broken spectacle on the floor. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing the marble would simply open up and swallow her whole. High above the ballroom floor, concealed in the shadowed privacy of the VIP mezzanine, the temperature plummeted. Lorenzo Moretti sat in a high-backed leather chair, a glass of neat scotch resting forgotten in his hand. Lorenzo was a ghost to the public, a rumor whispered in boardroom corners. But in the underworld, his name was law. He was the head of the Moretti Syndicate, a ruthless, methodical mafia boss who controlled the ports, the unions, and the lifeblood of Chicago's illicit trades. He was a man composed of cold calculation and lethal violence. And for the last 3 months, he had been quietly, deeply obsessed with the woman currently lying on the floor. It had started out of necessity. Clara Higgins, in her role as a senior auditor, had stumbled upon a complex money laundering discrepancy hidden deep within a rival shell company's books. She had unknowingly flagged an operation that was preparing to frame the Moretti family for federal racketeering. Clara thought she was just doing routine corporate compliance. She had no idea she had saved a mafia empire from a massive RICO indictment. Lorenzo had ordered his men to investigate her to ensure she wasn't a plant. What he found was a brilliant, lonely, incredibly beautiful woman who ordered takeout for one worked 80-hour weeks and sang softly to herself while watering the ferns in her cramped apartment. He had watched her from afar, captivated by her soft curves, her sharp mind, and the gentle kindness she showed to the stray cats in her alley. To Lorenzo, whose world was defined by sharp edges, deceit, and blood, Clara was an absolute revelation. She was soft. She was real. He had come to the gala tonight, solely because he knew she would be here. He had spent the last hour simply admiring the way the emerald dress hugged her full figure, furious at the insecurities he could read in her posture, wishing he could show her exactly how deeply a man could worship a body like hers. Now, as Lorenzo looked down at the shattered glass and the tears spilling onto Clara's cheeks, something inside him, something dark, ancient, and utterly merciless, snapped. Lorenzo slowly set his scotch glass on the mahogany table. The clink of the crystal was deafening to his men standing guard. "Matteo!" Lorenzo said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that promised absolute ruin. His underboss immediately stepped forward from the shadows. "Yes, boss." Lorenzo didn't take his dark, predatory eyes off Braden Hayes. "Lock the doors to the ballroom. Nobody leaves. And prepare the car." Clara pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, ignoring the sting of the glass. The laughter of Braden's friends was ringing in her ears, loud and oppressive. She reached for her torn hem, trying to gather her dignity, trying to stand. Suddenly the laughter died. It didn't fade out. It was cut off abruptly, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed directly out of the ballroom. Clara froze. The heavy, oppressive silence was far more terrifying than the mockery. She looked up through her tears and saw the crowd physically recoiling, parting like the Red Sea. Braden's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion, which rapidly morphed into visceral terror. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed against the marble. A pair of immaculate, handcrafted Italian leather shoes stopped inches from Clara's scraped hands. She slowly tilted her head up, taking in the sharp lines of a charcoal, custom-tailored suit. Lorenzo Moretti crouched down. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the onlookers. Men like Lorenzo Moretti did not bow. They did not kneel. Yet here was the most dangerous man in the Midwest, ignoring the ruined champagne and the shards of glass kneeling gracefully before a humiliated accountant. Clara held her breath. He was breathtakingly handsome, but in a severe, terrifying way. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline darkened by a shadow of stubble, and eyes so dark they looked like polished obsidian. He didn't look at the crowd. He only looked at her. "Let me," Lorenzo said. His voice was a deep, smooth baritone that sent a sudden, unexpected shiver down Clara's spine. Without waiting for permission, he reached out with large, warm hands. He didn't grab her roughly. His touch was incredibly gentle, reverent, even as his fingers wrapped securely around her forearms. With effortless, terrifying strength, Lorenzo lifted Clara from the floor, pulling her to her feet as if she weighed absolutely nothing at all. Clara swayed slightly, her bruised knees trembling. Lorenzo instantly stepped closer, wrapping a solid protective arm around her thick waist, anchoring her against his hard chest. The heat radiating from him was grounding. "Are you hurt, mia dolcezza?" he murmured, his thumb gently brushing a stray tear from her cheek. Clara stared at him, bewildered. I'm okay." "Who are you?" she whispered. "Someone who has been waiting far too long to introduce himself," Lorenzo replied softly. Then his demeanor shifted. The gentle warmth vanished, replaced by an arctic, suffocating chill as he slowly turned his head to look at Braden Hayes. Braden was sweating. The arrogant frat boy had finally recognized the monster standing before him. The Hayes family operated in Chicago real estate. They knew exactly who controlled the zoning boards, the unions, and the concrete suppliers. They knew the name, Moretti. "Mr. Moretti," Braden stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. His voice cracked. I didn't know she was with you. It was just a joke." Lorenzo's face was a mask of carved stone. "A joke requires humor, Braden. I am not laughing. I swear it was an accident," Braden pleaded, looking around at his friends for support, but they had practically fused themselves to the walls, terrified to even breathe in Lorenzo's direction. Lorenzo's dark eyes swept over Braden with utter disgust. "You shoved her. You tripped her. You mocked her weight." Lorenzo stepped forward, keeping Clara tucked safely to his side. "You looked at a woman who possesses more beauty, intellect, and worth in a single breath than your entire bloodline has generated in a century, and you thought you could use her for your amusement." "I'm sorry." Braden squeaked, his hands trembling. "I'll apologize. I'm sorry, miss. I really am." "It is entirely too late for apologies," Lorenzo interrupted, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried across the silent room. Lorenzo raised 2 fingers. From the perimeter of the room, 4 massive men in dark suits stepped forward. They didn't draw weapons, they didn't need to. The sheer menace rolling off them was enough to freeze the room. 2 of them flanked Braden, grabbing him by his arms with bone-crushing force. "Wait, my father is Richard Hayes. He does business with your associates." Braden shrieked his heels, dragging against the marble, as the men began to haul him backward toward the service exit. "Your father," Lorenzo stated coldly, "is about to find out exactly what happens when his worthless son disrespects what belongs to me." Lorenzo turned his back on the screaming bully, immediately focusing his attention back on Clara. The terrified accountant was shaking violently now, the adrenaline crashing in her system. "Come with me," Lorenzo said, his tone softening only for her. "You are bleeding. Let's get you out of here." Clara didn't have the strength to argue. She allowed Lorenzo to guide her through the parted, terrified crowd. They walked out of the grand doors of the Waldorf, the cool Chicago night air hitting Clara's heated face. An armored, jet-black Maybach Pullman was waiting on the curb at Walton Street, its engine purring softly. Matteo immediately opened the heavy rear door. Lorenzo helped Clara inside, sliding into the luxurious, dimly lit leather interior right beside her. As the Maybach pulled smoothly away into the city traffic, Clara finally found her voice. What is going to happen to him?" she asked, her voice trembling as she clutched her torn silk skirt. Lorenzo reached into a compartment, pulling out a pristine white handkerchief. He gently took her scraped palm in his hand, pressing the cloth to the superficial cuts. "Braden Hayes laughed because he thought you were heavy." Lorenzo said, his dark eyes meeting hers with a terrifying, absolute sincerity. "By sunrise, I am going to make sure he understands the true meaning of crushing weight. He will beg for his life under it." Lorenzo reached into his breast pocket and withdrew his cell phone. He dialed a single number. "It's Lorenzo," he spoke into the receiver, his eyes never leaving Clara's flushed, beautiful face. "Call in the Hayes real estate debts. Every single one of them. Freeze Richard Hayes's offshore accounts and ensure the bank forecloses on their properties at dawn. As for the son," Lorenzo paused, a dark, wicked promise flashing in his eyes. "Take him to the warehouse on Rush Street. Don't kill him yet. I want him awake when I get there." Clara gasped, pressing her back against the leather seat. She had just been rescued from a monster by the devil himself. The armored Maybach glided smoothly down Lakeshore Drive, the neon reflections of the Chicago skyline dancing across the tinted windows. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence was punctuated only by Clara's ragged breathing. She stared at the man sitting opposite her. Lorenzo Moretti was no longer the gentle savior who had picked her up off the ballroom floor. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched, radiating a lethal, focused energy. "Lorenzo." Clara whispered the name, feeling foreign, yet oddly safe on her tongue. "You don't have to do this. I'm used to it. Men like Braden. They always find a way to make me feel small." Lorenzo's dark eyes snapped to hers, flashing with a sudden intense fury that made her breath hitch. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until she could smell his cologne, a heady mix of cedar smoke and expensive scotch. "You are not small, Clara. You are a force of nature." Lorenzo said, his voice a gravelly command. He reached out his thumb, tracing the soft curve of her jawline. "For 30 years I have lived in a world of plastic women and hollow men. You have a mind that brought my entire syndicate's financial structure into sharp focus and a body that makes me want to burn this city to the ground just to keep you warm. You will never ever apologize for taking up space in my world." Clara's heart pounded violently against her ribs. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her full figure with such naked, unapologetic hunger and respect. The car pulled into the subterranean garage of the St. Regis, the city's most exclusive high-rise. "Matteo will take you up to the penthouse. It is completely secure," Lorenzo instructed, stepping out of the vehicle. He looked back at her, his expression hardening into stone. "I have an appointment on Rush Street." 30 minutes later, inside a cavernous, abandoned meatpacking warehouse on the edge of the Chicago River, the air smelled of rust-damp concrete and absolute terror. Braden Hayes was strapped to a reinforced steel chair in the center of the room. His bespoke tuxedo was ripped, and his perfectly coiffed blonde hair was matted with sweat. Above him, suspended by a heavy-duty industrial chain hoist, hung a massive wooden pallet loaded with 3 tons of raw cinder blocks. Lorenzo stood 10 feet away, rolling up the sleeves of his charcoal dress shirt, exposing forearms corded with muscle and faded ink. "You thought she was heavy, Braden?" Lorenzo asked softly, his voice echoing off the cavernous walls. He held a remote control in his right hand. He pressed a button. The machinery groaned. The chain hoist slipped, dropping the massive pallet 2 feet before catching with a violent jerk. The cinder block swayed mere inches above Braden's head. Braden let out a high-pitched, guttural scream, tears streaming down his face. "Please, oh my God! Please, Mr. Moretti! I was stupid! I'm a piece of shit! I know. Just don't kill me." "You humiliated the woman I love." Lorenzo stated, his voice devoid of any human empathy. "You made her bleed. You made her cry. You used her body as a punchline for your worthless friends." Lorenzo pressed the button again. The pallet dropped another 6 inches. Braden shrieked, squeezing his eyes shut, as the rough bottom of the wooden pallet actually grazed the top of his hair. He was hyperventilating, sobbing uncontrollably. The literal crushing weight of his arrogance was hanging by a single strained link of steel. "I'll give you everything," Braden sobbed, losing complete control of his bodily functions in his terror. "My dad's money, the offshore accounts in the Caymans, the shell companies. Just let me live." Meanwhile, high above the city, in the St. Regis penthouse, Clara could not sit still. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins. She was a forensic accountant. When her anxiety spiked, she needed data. She needed to solve a puzzle. She walked over to Matteo, who was standing guard by the bulletproof floor-to-ceiling windows. "Matteo, I need a laptop, and I need access to the files Lorenzo had you compile on the Hayes family." Matteo hesitated. "Miss Clara, the boss, said you should rest." "I don't need rest. I need a spreadsheet," Clara demanded, her voice finding a sudden authoritative steel that surprised even her. "Braden Hayes didn't just bump into me. He intentionally trapped my dress. He was waiting for me, and Lorenzo was waiting for him. Why was Lorenzo at the gala?" Matteo blinked, clearly caught off guard by her sharp deduction. Without a word, he retrieved a sleek, black, encrypted laptop from a secure safe and handed it to her. Clara sank into the plush leather sofa, her fingers flying across the keys. She bypassed the standard corporate firewalls of Hayes Real Estate, diving straight into the dark web ledger Lorenzo's hackers had aggregated. She pulled up the Cayman accounts Braden was currently screaming about at the warehouse. Her brow furrowed. She cross-referenced the routing numbers with the anomaly she had found at Deloitte 3 months ago, the very anomaly that had first brought her to Lorenzo's attention. Her blood ran cold. The Hayes family wasn't just laundering money. Richard Hayes, Braden's father, was the architect of the RICO frame-up. But worse, the financial transfers from the last 48 hours showed massive, untraceable wire payments to a private mercenary group known as Obsidian Tactical. Clara opened the metadata of the transaction. There was a geotag attached to the final payment confirmation. It was a ping from a burner phone. The location was the Rush Street warehouse. "Matteo!" Clara screamed, leaping up from the sofa, the laptop clattering to the floor. "Call Lorenzo. Right now, it's a trap. Braden's bullying it was a distraction. Richard Hayes knew Lorenzo was watching me. He used his own son as bait to draw Lorenzo to the warehouse." Inside the warehouse, Lorenzo watched Braden weep. He was disgusted. He raised his thumb to press the release button, intending to shatter Braden's legs and leave him crippled for life, when Matteo's encrypted phone buzzed violently in his pocket. Lorenzo frowned. He answered it, putting it to his ear. "Lorenzo, get out." "They're already there." Clara's voice screamed through the receiver, panicked and desperate. "Richard Hayes paid a hit squad. They tracked Braden's location." Before Lorenzo could even process her words, the skylights of the warehouse shattered in a synchronized explosion of glass and steel. 4 heavily armed mercenaries fast-roped through the ceiling, their assault rifles equipped with laser sights, cutting through the dusty air. Simultaneously, The heavy steel loading doors at the front of the warehouse were blown off their hinges by a breaching charge. "Cover!" Lorenzo roared, diving behind a massive steel lathe as the warehouse erupted into a deafening symphony of automatic gunfire. His men immediately returned fire. The darkness of the warehouse lit up with lethal staccato muzzle flashes. Bullets sparked off the concrete floor and tore through the metal equipment. Braden, still strapped to the chair, screamed in absolute agony as a stray bullet grazed his shoulder. Lorenzo remained ice-cold. Clara's warning had given him the split second he needed to avoid the initial volley which had ripped through the exact spot he had been standing. He unholstered his custom 9mm Beretta, his mind operating with terrifying lethal precision. He moved like a phantom through the shadows of his own warehouse. He flanked the two mercenaries advancing from the breached doors, taking them down with two clean, suppressed shots to the head. His men, hardened Mafia enforcers, quickly overwhelmed the remaining tactical team. Within 90 seconds, the warehouse was dead silent, save for the pathetic whimpering of Braden Hayes and the groan of the damaged chain hoist above him. Lorenzo walked slowly back to the center of the room, his suit dusted with debris, his eyes burning with an unholy rage. He looked at the bleeding, terrified frat boy. Richard Hayes had literally sacrificed his own son, sending him into Lorenzo's hands to serve as a geographical beacon for a hit squad. "It seems, Braden," Lorenzo said softly, picking up the remote control from the floor where he had dropped it. "Your father values your life even less than I do." Lorenzo didn't press the button to drop the concrete. Instead, he shot the control box of the industrial hoist. The machinery sparked, short-circuited, and permanently jammed. The 3 tons of cinder blocks were now frozen in place, hanging precariously by a single damaged chain link directly over Braden's head, groaning ominously with every passing second. It could snap in 5 minutes. It could snap in 5 days. "Enjoy the wait," Lorenzo whispered, turning his back and walking out into the Chicago night. An hour later, the door to the St. Regis penthouse opened. Clara was pacing the floor, her emerald dress still torn, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. When she saw Lorenzo walk in, covered in dust blood, splattered on his crisp white collar, a sob tore from her throat. She didn't think about his Mafia ties. She didn't think about the danger. She ran across the room and threw herself into his arms. Lorenzo caught her effortlessly dropping his weapon to the floor. He buried his face in her neck, his massive arms wrapping around her thick waist, holding her with a desperate, crushing intensity. He breathed in her scent, letting the reality of her warmth wash away the stench of gunpowder and blood. "You saved my life," Lorenzo murmured against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my empire and you saved my life." Again. Clara pulled back slightly, looking up into his dark obsidian eyes. "I couldn't let them take you. I couldn't." Lorenzo reached down, cupping her face in his large hands. He looked at her not just with desire, but with absolute reverence. "I told you that you were a force of nature, Clara. Men like Braden Hayes will spend the rest of their pathetic lives fearing the shadows. But you belong at the top of the empire." He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a claiming. It was a promise of violence against her enemies and absolute devotion to her soul. Clara kissed him back, pouring all her years of hidden insecurities, all her suppressed passion into the man who finally saw her exactly as she was and worshipped every single inch. 6 months later, the Chicago elite gathered once more, this time for the grand opening of the Moretti Financial Tower. The Hayes family was a memory. Richard Hayes was serving life in federal prison after an anonymous, meticulously detailed forensic audit was delivered to the FBI. Braden Hayes was in a psychiatric ward, his mind completely broken by 48 hours of waiting for 3 tons of concrete to crush him before Matteo finally pulled him out. A black Maybach pulled up to the red carpet. The paparazzi flashes erupted like lightning. The door opened, and Lorenzo Moretti stepped out, wearing a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. He turned and offered his hand. Clara stepped out into the flashing lights. She was no longer hiding. She wore a custom form-fitting crimson gown that celebrated her glorious curves diamonds glittering at her throat. She looked powerful, breathtaking, and entirely untouchable. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but there was no laughter. There were no cruel jokes. There was only awe and a healthy dose of fear. Lorenzo wrapped a protective, possessive arm around her full waist, pulling her flush against his side. He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her temple as the cameras flashed. "Ready, Mrs. Moretti," he whispered. Clara smiled, a brilliant, confident expression that brought the ruthless Mafia boss to his knees every single day. "Always," she replied. They walked up the steps together, the King of Chicago and the brilliant, beautiful queen who carried the weight of his empire with effortless grace. What an insane twist. Braden's own father used him as bait for a hit squad, but Clara's brilliant mind saved the day, proving she is the ultimate Mafia queen. From being humiliated on the floor to ruling the Chicago underworld, Clara's revenge is absolute perfection. Did you love this ending? Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves a dramatic Mafia romance, and subscribe for more epic twisted tales. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment?